Hi, my name is Natalie Brooks, and for years I was the one holding my family's company together without ever being named for it. I ran operations, absorbed risk, fixed problems before they reached the surface, and did it all while earning my master's degree at night after 14-hour days that no one ever questioned. I didn't complain. I didn't ask for praise. I believed results would speak for themselves. Then came my graduation dinner. Surrounded by family, executives, and polite applause, my father stood up to give a speech. He announced the future of the company, handing it to my sister. The golden child then laughed and called me just labor, the one who worked quietly in the background. The room chuckled. I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself. I smiled, finished my drink, and understood something with absolute clarity. This wasn't a celebration. It was my exit. I resigned without a scene. Weeks later, their biggest client called me directly and said, "We always knew you were the one running everything." What happened next changed all of our lives. If you were in my place, would you have stayed or walked away without a word? And where are you listening from right now? And what time is it there? I want to know. I'm not alone before we go on. People often assume favoritism starts with cruelty. In my family, it started with something quieter. Convenience. Claire was the dreamer, the one my parents liked to talk about at dinner parties. I was the reliable one, the child who learned early that being useful meant being safe. There were no dramatic scenes when we were younger, no shouting matches that would later be referenced as proof of injustice. Instead, there was a steady, invisible shift of weight. When something needed to be done, it landed on me. When something needed to be celebrated, it landed on her. Over time, that balance stopped feeling accidental and started feeling inevitable. I joined the family logistics company right after my bachelor's degree. Not because I was passionate about freight routes or vendor contracts, but because the company was struggling, and my father asked me to help out for a year or two. That phrase would follow me for the next decade. Help out, temporary. Just until things stabilized. I started in operations, quietly fixing inefficiencies no one had bothered to question in years. I streamlined warehouse workflows, renegotiated carrier agreements, built internal dashboards so managers could actually see where money was leaking. Every improvement was framed as teamwork. Every success was attributed to leadership. My name rarely came up unless something went wrong, and even then, it was spoken softly, like a tool being put back in a drawer. Claire came in later, after a short stint at a consulting firm she didn't like. She was introduced to clients as the future of the company, even though she barely understood how our distribution model worked. She was given projects that looked impressive but carried little risk. I handled the ones that could sink us if they failed. When I stayed late to untangle supply chain disruptions, my parents told people I was just wired that way. When Claire left early for networking events, they called her ambitious. No one ever said this out loud, but we all knew the rule. I was the engine. She was the face. Going back to school for my master's wasn't part of some grand plan. It was survival. I realized that if I didn't build something separate from the company, I would always be trapped inside it, defined by roles I hadn't chosen. I enrolled part-time at first, then full-time, balancing coursework with a job that quietly expanded to fill every gap others left behind. I studied operations strategy, organizational risk, systems design, the language of how businesses actually function when the spotlight isn't on them. At night, I wrote papers about key person dependency and fragile leadership structures, not yet realizing how closely those concepts mirrored my own life. My parents were proud in theory. They liked telling friends that both their daughters had advanced degrees. But the pride was abstract, almost decorative. When I talked about my research, my father would nod and say, "That's great, but make sure you don't neglect the company." When I mentioned applying what I was learning to improve our processes, he waved it off. "You already do enough," he said. Enough. Not too much. Never more. Claire's MBA, which came later and required far less sacrifice, was treated differently. It was framed as preparation. Mine was framed as enrichment, like a hobby that shouldn't interfere with real work. What hurt wasn't the workload. I could handle that. What hurt was the gradual realization that my value was conditional. I was indispensable as long as I stayed in the background, as long as I didn't ask for recognition, equity, or authority. The moment I hinted at formalizing my role, at aligning responsibility with title, the conversation shifted. My mother worried about family harmony. My father warned me not to rock the boat. Claire smiled sympathetically and told me I was already respected, as if respect paid salaries or protected futures. By the time I finished my master's, the company was running smoother than it ever had. Client retention was up. Operational costs were down. We had survived disruptions that had crushed competitors. Internally, people came to me before they went to anyone else. Externally, clients recognized my voice on calls, even if they didn't know my title. I told myself that eventually, this would be acknowledged. That logic would prevail. That effort, once undeniable, would force change. It's a comforting belief, especially for people who've been taught that patience is virtue rather than avoidance. The graduation dinner felt like the natural culmination of that belief. I thought it marked a transition, not into power, necessarily, but into visibility. I thought it meant my parents were ready to see me differently. Sitting there, watching my father announce the future of the company as if I were a footnote, I finally understood something I had resisted for years. They didn't misunderstand my value. They understood it perfectly. They just preferred it uncredited, because uncredited value is easier to control. That night didn't break me. It clarified me. For the first time, I stopped asking what I had done wrong and started asking a different question. What happens if I stop holding everything together? I didn't yet know the answer, but I knew I was about to find out. After that dinner, nothing changed on the surface. I went back to work the following Monday, like I always had, badge in, coffee cooling beside my laptop. Inbox already filling with problems that somehow always found their way to me first. The warehouse supervisors waited for my approval before adjusting routes. The finance team asked me to review forecasts before sending them upstairs. Even my sister forwarded emails with a casual, "Can you take a look at this?" As if I were a shared resource rather than a person who had just been publicly reduced to just labor. The irony was almost impressive. The company continued to run smoothly precisely because I was still there, invisible and intact. On paper, my role was vague. Operations support, strategy liaison. Titles that sounded helpful but carried no authority, no equity, no protection. In reality, I was the connective tissue holding the entire operation together. I tracked vendor performance, renegotiated contracts before penalties hit, and quietly built contingencies so disruptions wouldn't cascade. When a shipment stalled at a port, I solved it before anyone upstairs heard the word delay. When a major client threatened to walk over pricing, I restructured the service model and saved the account. Each fix disappeared into the system, absorbed so completely that people forgot there had ever been a problem. My father liked to say the company was a family. Families, in his mind, didn't need org charts or formal acknowledgments. Families trusted each other. Families didn't count favors. That philosophy sounded warm until you realized how selectively it was applied. Claire's role was announced, celebrated, and documented. Mine was assumed. When I asked once, carefully, whether we should formalize my position now that my responsibilities had expanded, my father frowned like I'd missed an obvious point. "Why do you need a title?" he asked. "Everyone knows what you do." What he meant was everyone benefited from what I did. Knowing wasn't the same as credit. Clients noticed before my family did, or maybe they noticed because my family never would. On calls, they asked for me by name. They thanked me for keeping things running during volatile quarters. One executive from a large retail partner joked that I was the only reason their account didn't give him ulcers. I smiled, deflected, and kept working. Recognition from the outside felt good, but it also made something else painfully clear. If people who didn't owe me anything could see my value, why couldn't the people who claimed to love me? The answer arrived slowly, through repetition rather than revelation. My value wasn't invisible to my family, it was inconvenient. Acknowledging it would have meant rebalancing power, and power was already promised. Claire was being groomed for leadership in public, while I was being relied upon in private. The structure worked as long as I stayed where I was. The moment I stepped forward, the entire narrative would crack. So the system did what systems do when threatened. It resisted. Weeks passed, then months. Claire began attending higher-level meetings, presenting decks I'd helped prepare. She spoke confidently, using language she'd absorbed rather than owned. When questions got too detailed, eyes drifted toward me. Sometimes she redirected them. Sometimes she didn't. Afterward, she'd thank me casually, like you thank someone for holding a door. My parents beamed. To them, this was progress. To me, it was confirmation. I started to notice how often decisions were made without me in the room, then handed to me to execute. Strategy announced, feasibility assumed. When timelines were unrealistic, I absorbed the pressure to make them work. When compromises were required, I negotiated them quietly so leadership wouldn't have to look indecisive. I told myself this was professionalism. That good operators didn't need applause. That the work spoke for itself. But work doesn't speak. People do. And I had been trained not to. Late one evening, long after most of the office had emptied, I sat alone reviewing a risk analysis I'd built for one of our largest accounts. It outlined something I'd been sensing intuitively for years. The company was dangerously dependent on a single, undocumented role. Mine. If I were unavailable, if I left, if I stopped absorbing complexity, the operation would falter quickly. I stared at the screen, at the clean bullet points and projected impact timelines, and felt a strange detachment. I had built this model for a client once, warning them about key person risk. I'd recommended succession planning, knowledge transfer, redundancy. They'd listened. My own company hadn't. The realization didn't come with anger, it came with fatigue. A deep, bone-level exhaustion that no weekend off could fix. I thought about my master's research, about systems that fail not because of malice, but because of misaligned incentives. I thought about how long I'd been incentivized to stay quiet. And for the first time, I allowed myself to consider the unthinkable. What if I stopped? Not dramatically, not with ultimatums or speeches. Just stopped being the silent infrastructure. What if I stepped out of the role everyone relied on, but refused to name? The idea scared me more than it should have. Fear, I realized, was the last thing keeping the arrangement intact. Fear of being called selfish. Fear of disrupting family harmony. Fear of proving, somehow, that my father had been right to see me as labor rather than leadership. The next morning, I walked into the office with a clarity I hadn't felt before. Nothing external had changed. The same emails, the same requests, the same assumptions. But internally, something had shifted. I began documenting processes I'd kept in my head. I stopped volunteering for tasks that weren't explicitly mine. I redirected questions back to the people whose names were on the org chart. No announcements. No confrontations. Just small, deliberate adjustments that exposed how much had been resting on me alone. The response was immediate and subtle. Things slowed. People grew frustrated. My father asked why certain issues were escalating. I explained calmly that they were outside my defined role. He looked surprised, almost offended, as if I'd broken an unspoken agreement. In a way, I had. The agreement had always been that I would do more than I was asked, and accept less than I deserved. Breaking that pattern felt like stepping into cold air after years in a stuffy room. By the time I drafted my resignation letter, the decision didn't feel dramatic. It felt inevitable. I read it twice before sending, the language precise and professional, devoid of emotion. Gratitude. Notice. Transition support. No accusations, no explanations. When I clicked send, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt calm. The kind of calm that comes when you finally stop arguing with reality. I didn't know yet how quickly the consequences would surface, or how far the ripples would travel. I only knew that the company had been running on my silence for years, and silence, once broken, is impossible to replace. My resignation didn't land the way people imagine resignations do. There was no emergency meeting, no immediate confrontation, no dramatic phone call demanding explanations. Instead, there was silence. A long, uncomfortable silence that stretched across 2 full days, broken only by routine emails and calendar invites that still included my name, as if nothing had changed. It was the kind of silence that pretends a problem doesn't exist, hoping it will solve itself out of embarrassment. I recognized it immediately. My family had always used silence as a delay tactic, a way to buy time until emotions cooled and people returned to their assigned places. This time, I didn't. On the third day, my father finally asked me to step into his office. The door closed behind me with a soft click that sounded heavier than it should have. He didn't offer me a seat. He stood behind his desk, hands resting flat on the surface, eyes fixed somewhere just over my shoulder. "I don't understand why you do this now," he said. Not why I was unhappy, not whether something had gone wrong. Why now? Timing had always mattered more to him than truth. I told him calmly that my decision wasn't sudden, that it was the result of years of misalignment between responsibility and recognition. He waved a hand, dismissive. "You're overthinking it," he said. "This is a family company. We don't nickel and dime each other over titles. It's heart surges." That was when I understood something with absolute clarity. In his mind, my labor wasn't work. It was contribution. Something owed. Something absorbed into the collective without the need for acknowledgement. When Claire contributed, it was leadership. When I contributed, it was support. Same action, different meaning. I tried once more, not to argue, but to explain. I told him about the operational risks, the key person dependency, the lack of succession planning. I told him what would happen if I wasn't there to catch things before they fell apart. He listened, but his expression didn't change. "You worry too much," he said. "We'll be fine." I left his office with the strange feeling that I had just delivered a warning to someone who had already decided not to hear it. Words spread slowly after that. Managers stopped by my desk, confused, asking if the resignation was real. Claire looked genuinely startled when she found out, as if she had assumed I would always be there, quietly absorbing overflow. She pulled me aside one afternoon and said, "You know Dad didn't mean it the way it sounded." I looked at her for a long moment before replying. "He meant exactly what he said," I told her. "You just weren't on the receiving end." My mother called that night. Her voice was careful, measured, already halfway into damage control. She asked if I was stressed, if school had been too much, if I needed a break rather than a resignation. She framed my decision as burnout, not boundary. Burnout could be treated. Boundaries would require change. I told her I was fine. Better than fine, actually. I told her I was done being invisible. She sighed and said, "You've always been so strong." It sounded like a compliment, but I heard the subtext clearly. Strong people don't need protection. Strong people don't need credit. Strong people can be leaned on indefinitely. My last day came quietly. No farewell lunch. No speech. A few awkward hugs from coworkers who didn't know what to say. I handed over documentation I'd spent weeks preparing, detailed process maps, and contingency plans that should have existed years earlier. I knew they wouldn't fully understand them yet. Understanding requires context, and context had been living in my head for a long time. As I packed my bag, I felt a flicker of doubt. Not about leaving the company, but about leaving my family to deal with the fallout. Guilt rose instinctively. Sharp and familiar, but I didn't act on it. I reminded myself that responsibility without authority is not loyalty. It's exploitation, dressed up as trust. The first week after I left was quiet. Too quiet. My phone stayed mostly silent, which I knew meant people were scrambling internally, trying to solve problems without escalating them. By the second week, the cracks started to show. A shipment delay that would have been a quick fix turned into a client complaint. A vendor negotiation stalled because no one knew the history behind the terms. Meetings ran long and ended without decisions. Claire called once, asking where I'd stored a particular set of files. I told her where to find them, and ended the call before the conversation drifted into something else. By the third week, my father called. His tone was different now, tighter, edged with frustration. He asked questions he'd never bothered to ask before. How certain workflows functioned, why certain clients had specific expectations, how close we actually were to missing performance benchmarks. I answered factually, without judgment. I didn't offer solutions unless asked. I didn't volunteer to step in. At one point, he snapped. "You used to just handle this. I paused before responding. I used to be allowed to, I said. The line went quiet. What none of them said out loud, but all of them were beginning to feel, was that the system they'd relied on wasn't broken. It had been removed. And the person who removed it hadn't done so out of spite or drama, but out of necessity. That made it harder to argue against. You can fight anger. You can dismiss emotion. You can't easily refute absence, especially when absence exposes truths you've avoided for years. One evening, sitting alone in my apartment, I opened my laptop and reread my master's thesis. It was about organizational resilience, about how systems collapse not because people leave, but because leadership refuses to recognize where real value lies. I smiled at the irony. I had written my way out of my own life without realizing it. The graduation dinner hadn't been the beginning of the end. It had been the moment the end finally admitted its name. For the first time since resigning, I felt something close to peace. Not because things were easy, but because they were honest. Whatever came next, consequences, conflict, opportunity, I knew I would meet it as myself, not as someone else's uncredited labor. And somewhere beyond the discomfort my family was now experiencing, a different future was already beginning to take shape. The weeks after my departure unfolded with a strange, unsettling rhythm. On the surface, the company continued to operate. Emails went out, trucks moved, invoices were issued. From a distance, it looked like continuity. Up close, it was something else entirely, a series of small misalignments that began to compound. I heard about them indirectly at first, through former colleagues who texted late at night with questions they used to ask me in the hallway. I answered what I could, without stepping back into the role I'd left. Each answer was precise and contained. Each boundary held. My father tried to maintain the narrative that everything was under control. He told clients we were in a transition phase, told managers to be flexible, told himself that systems ran themselves once they were built. But systems don't run themselves. They run on people who understand the logic behind them. And logic, without context, becomes brittle. The first real crack came when a long-standing vendor pushed back on a pricing adjustment. The agreement had been informal, grounded in years of trust and mutual concessions I'd negotiated quietly. Without that history, the conversation turned adversarial. The vendor escalated. The margin disappeared. No one noticed until finance flagged the numbers weeks later. Claire stepped into the gap with confidence that hadn't yet been tested. She chaired meetings, spoke about alignment, referenced frameworks from her MBA classes. None of it was wrong. It just wasn't enough. When questions turned operational, when timelines slipped or dependencies collided, she deferred. Sometimes to my father. Sometimes to teams who had never been asked to think that way before. The organization began to feel the absence not as a dramatic failure, but as friction everywhere. Decision latency increased. Accountability blurred. People started documenting conversations that used to end with a nod. I stayed busy. Not to avoid thinking about them, but because my life finally had room to expand. I took a short contract with a regional distributor, advising on process optimization. The work was clean, defined, respected. When they asked for my opinion, they listened. When they disagreed, they explained why. No one assumed my time was theirs by default. The difference was jarring. I realized how long I'd been living inside an unspoken tax, an expectation that my competence was communal property. Then the call came from HarborLink Group. I recognized the name instantly. They were the company's largest client, responsible for nearly a third of annual revenue. Their operations spanned multiple ports and inland hubs, and I'd been their primary point of contact for years, even if my title never reflected it. The call wasn't urgent. It wasn't dramatic. It was professional. The VP of operations asked if I had time to talk later that week. He said they were reevaluating some strategic partnerships. I said yes. When we spoke, he didn't mention my resignation right away. He asked about my master's, about my thesis, about how I approached risk. He asked questions no one in my family ever had, questions that assumed competence rather than tested loyalty. Then he said it plainly. "We've noticed a drop in responsiveness and continuity since you left Brooks & Co., he said. "We're concerned about execution risk." I didn't comment. I didn't need to. He continued. We'd like to explore whether you'd consider coming on with us. Director level. Operations strategy. I remember staring out the window as he spoke, the city moving on below, and feeling something shift into place. Not triumph. Not vindication. Alignment. He wasn't offering me a job out of sympathy or rebellion. He was mitigating risk. He had identified where real capability lived and was acting accordingly. That mattered to me more than the title. Weeks later, HarborLink formally notified Brooks and Co. that they were suspending renewal discussions pending leadership stabilization. The phrasing was careful, legal, unmistakable. The effect was immediate. Panic surged where denial had been. My father called that night, his voice tight, clipped, stripped of its usual authority. He asked if I knew anything about HarborLink's concerns. I answered honestly. They're worried about continuity, I said. They always have been. He paused, then asked the question he'd been avoiding for years. Can you help us fix this? I didn't answer right away. I thought about the graduation dinner. About being called just labor in a room full of people who benefited from my work. About the silence that followed my resignation, the assumption that I'd return once the discomfort peaked. I thought about the difference between help and rescue. Help respects boundaries. Rescue erases them. I can't, I said finally. Not in the way you're asking. His frustration flared. He accused me of abandoning the family, of leveraging my departure for personal gain. I let the words pass, without absorbing them. I didn't take anything from you, I replied. I stopped giving it away. The call ended without resolution. The next morning, my mother texted, asking if we could talk. I agreed, with conditions. We met at a cafe halfway between our homes, neutral ground. She looked tired, smaller somehow. She spoke about fear about losing the business, about what people would say, about how fast things were unraveling. I listened, then said what I'd practiced, saying without apology. I won't come back without authority, equity, and a clear role. And even then, I don't know if I want to. She stared at me, stunned. For the first time, she seemed to see the cost of what they'd asked of me for years. By the end of that month, HarborLink made their move. They offered me the position formally. Director of Operations Strategy. The contract was clear. The authority real. The respect embedded in the structure, I accepted. Not because it proved my family wrong, but because it proved something to me. Value doesn't need to be begged for. It needs to be placed where it can be recognized. When Brooks and Co. lost the HarborLink contract shortly after, the calls started again. This time, they weren't angry. They were desperate. I didn't gloat. I didn't lecture. I simply held the boundary I'd drawn. The silence I'd once been punished for had become my protection. And in that quiet, I understood the truth I'd been circling for years. Leaving wasn't betrayal. Staying invisible would have been. The first call came at 6:12 a.m. The kind of hour that tells you someone hasn't slept and doesn't intend to let you do so either. I let it ring. Then again at 6:14. Then a message. We need to talk. Now. I recognized my father's number, but I didn't feel the familiar spike of anxiety. Instead, there was a steady calm, almost clinical, as if I were observing a pattern rather than being trapped inside it. By the time I returned the call later that morning, I already knew what he was going to say. HarborLink had formally notified them they were terminating the contract. The words had finally landed. He didn't ease into it. He never did when control slipped. They're pulling out, he said, voice tight with disbelief. Completely. They're saying it's about leadership continuity. He paused, then added the part meant to sting. They mentioned you. I let the silence stretch just long enough to make the truth unavoidable. I'm not surprised, I said. He exhaled sharply. So, you knew this would happen. It wasn't a question. It was an accusation dressed up as insight. I knew it was a risk, I replied. I warned you about it. The difference mattered. He didn't acknowledge it. By noon, my mother called. Her voice was softer, but the fear beneath it was louder. She spoke about payroll, about cash flow, about how fast things were spiraling now that the biggest client was gone. She asked if I could talk to someone at HarborLink, maybe clarify, maybe smooth things over. I listened without interrupting, then said the sentence that had been forming for weeks. I don't have that role anymore. She tried to pivot, framing it as a favor, as something I could do out of love. I stopped her gently. Love doesn't require me to undo my own boundaries, I said. The line went quiet. When she spoke again, her voice cracked. We're scared, she admitted. I believed her. I just didn't mistake fear for accountability. The calls kept coming. From my father, from my mother, from Claire. Each one carried a different tone, but the same underlying assumption that I would step in once the consequences became real enough. Claire's calls surprised me the most. She sounded shaken, stripped of the confidence she'd worn so easily before. I didn't know it was this fragile, she said. Dad keeps asking me questions I don't know how to answer. I told her the truth without cruelty. That's because the company was built around work you never had to see. She was quiet for a long moment. Can you help me? She asked finally. The question wasn't manipulative. It was honest. And that made it harder. I can't be your safety net, I said. But I can tell you what you need to learn. That was the first real shift. Instead of asking me to fix things, they started asking me to explain them. Not in the abstract, not as a favor, but as a recognition that something fundamental had been missing. My father asked for documentation he'd never wanted before. My mother asked what succession planning actually meant. Claire asked how decisions were made when there wasn't time for consensus. I answered selectively, carefully, refusing to slide back into execution. Knowledge is not labor. I was willing to share one without giving the other away. Meanwhile, my new role at HarborLink unfolded with an ease that still startled me. On my first day, I was introduced not as a helper, but as a leader. People deferred appropriately. Decisions had owners. Expectations were explicit. When I raised concerns, they were addressed, not deflected. I realized how much energy I'd spent translating myself in my old life, softening language, minimizing impact so no one felt threatened. Here, clarity was valued. Directness was efficient. I didn't have to earn the right to speak. It was built into the structure. 2 weeks into the job, HarborLink finalized their exit from Brooks & Co. The news rippled outward quickly. Suppliers tightened terms. Smaller clients hesitated. The company my family had built over decades began to shrink in visible ways. I didn't celebrate it. I didn't need to. The truth was doing its work without my involvement. My father called again that night, voice hoarse. We're bleeding, he said. We need help. I took a breath. What you need is leadership alignment, I said. And I can't provide that from the outside. He was silent for a long time. When he spoke again, the anger was gone, replaced by something unfamiliar. What would it take for you to come back? He asked. I didn't answer immediately. Not because I was tempted, but because the question deserved honesty. It would take ownership, I said finally. Equity. Authority. A role that matches responsibility. And, even then, I'm not sure. He laughed softly, a sound edged with disbelief. You're serious. I've always been serious, I replied. You just didn't need to hear it before. The call ended without agreement, but also without accusation. That felt like progress. The final call came from my mother, a few days later. She didn't ask me to return. She didn't ask me to intervene. She asked something else entirely. When did you stop trusting us? She said quietly. I closed my eyes. When I realized trust was conditional. I answered. When it only worked one way. She didn't argue. She didn't defend. She just said, I'm sorry. It wasn't a solution. It wasn't a fix. But it was the first apology that didn't ask for anything in return. As the weeks passed, the urgency faded. The calls slowed. My family began dealing with the reality they'd postponed for years. Consultants were hired, roles were redefined. The company didn't collapse overnight, but it didn't recover either, not fully. And that, I realized, was okay. Some structures are meant to change once their true foundations are revealed. Late one evening, after a long day at HarborLink, I sat alone in my apartment and thought about the graduation dinner again. About the laughter. About the word, labor. About how small I'd felt in that moment. The contrast was almost surreal. Nothing about my capability had changed. Only the context had. The difference between being used and being valued wasn't effort. It was alignment. I didn't lose my family when I refused to save their company. I lost the illusion that my worth depended on their recognition. And in its place, I found something steadier: respect that didn't vanish when I stopped giving more than I had. The formal offer from HarborLink arrived on a Tuesday morning, neatly formatted, precise, and unmistakably intentional. It wasn't rushed, and it wasn't emotional. It laid out scope, authority, compensation, and decision rights with a clarity that felt almost foreign after years of navigating ambiguity. Director of Operations Strategy. Real budget ownership. Direct reporting line to the executive team. A mandate to redesign systems, not just patch them. As I read through it, I realized something quietly profound. This wasn't a reward for leaving my family's company. It was a correction for staying as long as I had. I didn't sign right away. Not because I hesitated, but because I wanted to sit with the feeling. I made tea, stood by the window, and let the city move below me. For years, I had told myself that recognition would come if I just worked harder, stayed longer, proved myself more clearly. The offer in my hand dismantled that belief without malice. Recognition doesn't come from endurance. It comes from alignment. HarborLink wasn't taking a chance on me. They were removing a risk they'd been tracking for years. When I finally accepted, the response was simple: a welcome call, a calendar invite, a clear start date, no speeches. No promises of future consideration. Just trust, formalized. On my first day, I walked into a room where my name carried weight before I spoke. People listened. They asked questions that assumed I knew what I was doing. When I pushed back on timelines, no one told me to be more patient or less sensitive. They adjusted the plan. The efficiency of it all was almost disorienting. Back at Brooks & Co., the absence became undeniable. My father stopped pretending things were fine and started naming what he'd avoided. "We didn't realize how much you handled," he admitted once, his voice low, stripped of bravado. It wasn't a confession. It was an observation, spoken too late to change the past, but not too late to inform the future. Consultants came in, bringing frameworks and recommendations I'd made years earlier. They echoed my language without knowing it, diagnosing the same weaknesses I'd flagged in quieter ways. Hearing my thoughts reflected back through strangers was strange, but validating. The truth had a way of resurfacing. Even when ignored, Claire struggled the most. She wasn't incompetent, but she was unprepared, and the gap between those two realities widened under pressure. She called me one evening, not to ask for help, but to say something I hadn't expected. "I didn't know," she said. "I thought you liked being behind the scenes." I didn't rush to reassure her. "I was good at it," I replied. "That's not the same thing." She was quiet, then admitted that the pedestal she'd been placed on felt increasingly unstable. For the first time, I felt something shift between us, not closeness, exactly, but honesty. At HarborLink, I was already reshaping processes that had resisted change for years, not by force, but by naming incentives correctly. People didn't resist clarity. They resisted losing power without understanding why. I built redundancies where heroics had once been praised. I documented decisions that had previously lived in memory. I insisted on succession planning, on shared knowledge, on systems that didn't collapse when one person stepped away. More than once, someone commented on how different my approach felt. I smiled and said, "It's designed to survive me." The contrast between my two worlds sharpened daily. At work, my boundaries were assumed. At home, they were still being negotiated. My mother tried to reframe our relationship, asking fewer questions, offering fewer expectations. My father oscillated between pride and resentment, struggling to reconcile the daughter he depended on with the one who no longer made herself available on demand. I didn't rush him. Growth, I was learning, couldn't be forced from the outside. The real turning point came when Brooks & Co. formally announced the loss of the HarborLink contract to their board. The room, I was told later, went silent. Numbers that had once looked stable now felt precarious. Decisions made casually in the past suddenly carried weight. My absence wasn't mentioned by name, but it was present in every line item, every revised forecast. The company wasn't failing, but it was shrinking, and shrinkage forces honesty. There was no villain to blame, no single event to point to, just a series of choices that had accumulated over time. My father called that night, not to ask for help, but to tell me the news himself. His voice was steady, almost resigned. "They're gone," he said. "We'll manage." I believed him. Managing was something he understood now, in a way he hadn't before. "I'm sorry for how I spoke to you at the dinner," he added, quietly. It wasn't an apology wrapped in expectation. It was a statement, left there without demand. I thanked him. It was enough for now. Later, alone in my apartment, I thought about the word he'd used, labor, and how casually it had been said. For years, I'd internalized it as a limitation, a dismissal. Now I understood it differently. Labor is valuable, essential, but only when it's recognized as such. What had hurt wasn't being labor, it was being told that labor was all I was allowed to be. The offer from HarborLink didn't elevate me. It named me. It put language around what I'd already been doing and placed it where it could be seen and sustained. That distinction mattered. I hadn't escaped my family to become someone else. I had left to become myself, without translation or apology. As I prepared for the weeks ahead, new challenges, new responsibilities, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Not relief, not victory. Stability. The kind that comes when your external life finally matches your internal truth. Whatever happened next with my family, with their company, with the narratives they told about me, I knew one thing for certain: I was no longer available to be reduced. And that, more than any title, was the real promotion. The invitation came through my mother, not my father, which told me more than the words ever could. She asked if I would be willing to sit down with the family, not to fix anything, not to make promises, but to talk. The phrasing mattered. For the first time, there was no urgency baked into the request, no implication that something would collapse if I said no. I agreed on one condition: it had to be on neutral ground, and it had to be time-bound. I wasn't stepping back into endless conversations that went nowhere. She accepted immediately. That, too, was new. We met at a quiet restaurant halfway between my apartment and their office, the kind of place where conversations stayed low and private by default. When I arrived, they were already seated. My father stood when he saw me, then hesitated, unsure whether to lean in for a hug or sit back down. I nodded, took my seat, and ordered water. No small talk. No rehearsed smiles. The air between us was tense but contained, like everyone had finally learned that raised voices wouldn't get them what they wanted. My father spoke first. Not with authority, but with caution. "We're restructuring," he said. "We brought in outside advisors. It's slower than we expected." I listened without interrupting. He talked about cash flow, about morale, about how difficult it was to replace institutional knowledge once it was gone. He didn't say my name in that context, but he didn't have to. The absence was understood. When he finished, he looked at me and asked something I'd waited years to hear. What did we miss? The question landed heavily, not because it was dramatic, but because it was specific. Not why did you leave, not how can you help us now, but what did we miss? I took a breath. "You missed where the company actually lived," I said. "Not on org charts or titles, but in the unspoken systems. You rewarded visibility, not reliability. You assumed what was quiet didn't need protection." My mother's eyes filled, but she didn't interrupt. Claire stared down at the table, hands folded tightly. I continued, carefully. "You taught me to be responsible without teaching you how to be accountable to me. And when I finally asked for recognition, you treated it like a threat." My father nodded slowly. "I thought I was being practical," he said. "I thought titles would complicate things." I met his gaze. "They don't complicate things," I replied. "They clarify them. And clarity protects everyone." Claire finally spoke. Her voice was steadier than I expected. "I didn't know how much you carried," she said. "I know you've heard that before, but I mean it differently now." I believed her. The past months had stripped away her assumptions in a way no lecture ever could. "I don't want what I have if it means you disappear," she added. It wasn't a promise. It was a recognition. That was enough. My mother reached across the table, stopping short of touching my hand. "We didn't ask," she said softly. "We assumed. We assumed you were fine because you never complained." I didn't soften the truth. "I complained in the only way you allowed," I said. "By continuing to perform." Silence followed, thick but honest. This wasn't reconciliation. It was inventory. They asked what I wanted now. Not from the company, from them. The question startled me more than anything else that day. I answered slowly. "I want a relationship that doesn't depend on my usefulness. I want conversations that don't end when I say no, and I want my work anywhere to be acknowledged without me having to beg for it." My father nodded. "We can try," he said. "Trying isn't the same as changing," I replied. He didn't argue. We talked about logistics after that: holidays, communication, boundaries. I was clear. I wouldn't be stepping into advisory roles. I wouldn't be fielding crisis calls. If they wanted updates about my life, they could ask without expecting access. They agreed, unevenly but sincerely. When the check arrived, I paid my share without comment. It felt important. Walking out into the cool evening air, I noticed something unexpected. I wasn't drained. I wasn't braced for fallout. The meeting hadn't fixed anything, but it hadn't taken anything from me either. That was the difference boundaries make. They don't guarantee peace, they guarantee safety. At work, the weeks that followed were dense and productive. HarborLink trusted me with decisions that would ripple across regions. I built teams that cross-trained by default. I made redundancy a virtue, not a sign of weakness. When someone asked what would happen if I left, I smiled and said, "The system will hold." That was the point. Leadership, I was learning, isn't about indispensability. It's about continuity without you. One afternoon, after a long strategy session, my VP pulled me aside. "You're changing how people think about ownership," he said. "It's noticeable." I thanked him, then corrected him gently. "I'm changing how people think about responsibility." The distinction mattered. Ownership can be symbolic. Responsibility is operational. That night, at home, I opened a notebook and wrote down the lessons I'd been collecting without naming. That silence isn't neutrality, it's often power choosing comfort. That families, like companies, will take what they're allowed to take. That leaving doesn't always mean abandoning, it can mean refusing to disappear. I realized how much of my healing had come not from confrontation, but from alignment. From placing myself where my values weren't constantly negotiated. My phone buzzed once before I went to sleep, a message from my mother. "Thank you for meeting us today. We're going to therapy next week." I stared at the screen, then typed back a simple reply. "I'm glad." No exclamation point. No reassurance. Just truth. As I turned off the light, I thought about the girl I'd been at that graduation dinner, sitting still while a room laughed politely at a sentence that erased her. I wished I could tell her this part. That the laughter would fade. That the silence afterward would teach everyone something they refused to learn the easy way. That one day, she would sit across from the same people and be asked, not demanded, to explain her worth. And that when that day came, she wouldn't need to raise her voice. Change didn't arrive with fireworks. There was no moment where everything snapped into place or where apologies erased history. What followed the meeting was quieter, slower, and far less satisfying in the way people expect resolution to feel. My parents went to therapy, just as my mother had said. I didn't attend. That boundary mattered. Whatever they unpacked, there was theirs to face, not something I needed to witness or validate. Progress, when it came, showed up in small, almost invisible ways: fewer urgent calls, fewer loaded questions disguised as concern, longer pauses before expectations were voiced. The company continued to shrink, not dramatically, but deliberately. They sold off a non-core division. They let go of 2 long-standing managers who had thrived in ambiguity and struggled with structure. None of it made headlines. None of it inspired sympathy. It was the kind of recalibration that only happens once illusions wear thin. My father updated me occasionally, not to seek advice, but to share facts. I listened, responded briefly, and kept my distance. The business was no longer my responsibility, and I didn't need to pretend otherwise to preserve peace. Claire changed, though not in the way people usually imagine redemption. She didn't step down. She didn't make grand gestures. Instead, she started asking different questions. She brought in people who knew what she didn't. She stopped performing confidence and started practicing competence. Once, over coffee, she admitted something I hadn't expected. "I thought leadership was about being seen," she said. "Now I think it's about being honest about what you can't see yet." I nodded. It wasn't an apology, it was an evolution. I respected it more. At HarborLink, my role deepened. The systems we'd begun to build started holding under pressure. When a regional disruption hit one of the ports, teams adapted without escalation. Decisions flowed to the right level. Accountability held. Watching that unfold gave me a strange sense of relief, not pride, exactly, but confirmation. This was what functional looked like. Not perfection, but resilience. No one panicked. No one waited for permission that didn't exist. The organization breathed, adjusted, moved forward. And yet, in the spaces between competence and calm, something unexpected surfaced. Grief. Not the kind that comes with loss, but the kind that comes with clarity. I grieved the years I'd spent believing my value was conditional. I grieved the version of myself who thought endurance was a virtue rather than a warning sign. I grieved the family dynamic that could have been, if honesty hadn't been deferred for so long. Healing, I was learning, wasn't about replacing pain with strength. It was about letting both exist without one erasing the other. My mother called one afternoon, weeks after starting therapy. Her voice sounded different, less urgent, less careful. "I wanted you to know," she said, "that I'm starting to understand how much we asked without asking." She didn't expect absolution. She didn't ask if I forgave her. She simply named the truth and left it there. I thanked her and changed the subject. Some conversations don't need to be prolonged to be meaningful. The real test came during the holidays, the first major gathering since everything had changed. They invited me, cautiously, emphasizing that there were no expectations. I sat with the invitation for a long time. Not because I felt obligated, but because I wanted to be intentional. In the end, I agreed to stop by for dessert, not dinner. I arrived on my own schedule. I left when I felt done. No one commented. No one flinched. The restraint felt like respect. Later that night, alone again, I noticed something I hadn't expected. I didn't replay conversations, I didn't brace for backlash. I didn't catalog slights or prepare defenses. The absence of that internal noise felt like space opening up. Space for choices that weren't reactions. Space for relationships that didn't require performance. At work, a younger colleague asked me for advice during a mentoring session. She said she was struggling to assert herself without feeling like she was being difficult. I listened, then told her something I wish someone had told me earlier. "If your value only shows up when you're quiet, that's not respect," I said. "That's convenience." She nodded slowly, like something had clicked into place. Watching that happen felt like a small kind of repair. Passed forward. The family companies stabilized at a smaller scale. They survived, they adapted. They learned, unevenly but genuinely. They didn't thrive the way they once imagined, but they stopped pretending that image mattered more than reality. That, too, was a form of healing. Not every story ends with triumph, some end with accuracy. One evening, after a long week, I stood on my balcony and watched the city lights flicker on. I thought about the graduation dinner, again not with anger, but with distance. The words still mattered. The harm still existed. But they no longer defined me. I had built something separate, something solid, something that didn't require anyone else's permission to stand. I realized then that the aftermath no one applauds is often the most important part, the part where boundaries are tested quietly, where growth doesn't announce itself, where you wake up one day and notice that your life no longer revolves around proving anything. The absence of applause wasn't a failure, it was freedom. And in that freedom, I finally understood the lesson that had taken years to surface. You don't heal by being seen at last. You heal by choosing where you belong and staying there long enough to trust it. The moment I knew the boundary was real didn't come during a confrontation or a dramatic request. It came quietly, disguised as a reasonable ask. My father called one afternoon with a measured tone. I recognized immediately the voice he used when he wanted something to sound collaborative. He said the consultants had identified a short-term gap in operational oversight. Nothing major. Just a few weeks of transition support while new systems settled. It wouldn't be like before, he assured me. We'd pay you. Officially. The words were careful, almost respectful. 10 months earlier, they might have worked. I didn't answer right away. I asked questions instead. Scope. Authority. Decision rights. Exit conditions. He hesitated, then admitted that while they could compensate me, final decisions would still route through him and the board. I nodded, even though he couldn't see it. Then no, I said calmly. There was no edge in my voice. No anger, just clarity. The line went silent. Not shocked silence. Processing silence. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter. I thought this time might be different. I didn't correct him. It was different. The difference was that I wasn't negotiating with hope anymore. After we hung up, I sat still for a long time, waiting for the familiar rush of guilt. It didn't come. What came instead was something steadier: confirmation. Boundaries aren't real because you state them. They're real because you keep them when they become inconvenient. Especially when the request is wrapped in politeness and nostalgia, when it appeals to the part of you that still wants things to be easier than they are. That night, my mother texted. She didn't argue my decision. She didn't ask me to reconsider. She simply wrote, "I understand why you said no." I stared at the message longer than necessary. Understanding without persuasion was new territory. I replied with a single word. "Thank you." It felt like a milestone, small but meaningful. At HarborLink, my work continued to expand in ways that affirmed my choice daily. I was trusted with a cross-regional initiative that required navigating competing incentives and cultural differences. No one questioned whether I had the authority to lead it. The assumption was built in. When conflicts arose, they were addressed openly, not buried under hierarchy. Watching the boundary between personal worth and professional contribution remain intact felt like breathing clean air after years in a closed room. The family dynamic shifted again after that call. Not backward, not forward, but into something more honest. My father stopped asking indirectly. When he needed something, he named it clearly. When the answer was no, he accepted it without escalation. That didn't erase the past, but it changed the present. My mother stopped translating his requests into emotional appeals. Claire stopped positioning herself as a buffer. Each of them adjusted, unevenly, learning that access to me was no longer automatic. During a quiet weekend, I revisited my old journals, the ones I'd kept during my master's program. Page after page documented the same tension I'd felt for years, wanting to be seen without being consumed, wanting recognition without control. I realized then that my education hadn't just given me credentials. It had given me language. Language to name what was happening. Language to refuse what no longer fit. Knowledge had been the slow fuse. The dinner had been the spark. One afternoon, I ran into a former colleague from Brooks & Co. at a conference. She hugged me, then said, "You look lighter." I laughed softly. "I feel clearer," I replied. She told me the company was stabilizing, smaller but steadier. That my father talked about me differently now. With respect, but also with distance. I told her I was glad, and I meant it. I didn't need proximity to validate progress. The most surprising moment came weeks later, when my father sent me a brief email. No preamble. No request. Just a line that said, "We're updating the org structure. We're removing informal dependencies and documenting ownership." I should have done this years ago. I read it twice. Then I closed my laptop and let myself feel the quiet satisfaction of change that didn't require my participation. That, I realized, was the real win. Not being needed to fix what should have been built correctly in the first place. As winter edged into spring, my life settled into a rhythm that felt sustainable. Work that challenged me without draining me, family contact that respected distance. A sense of self that didn't rise or fall based on how useful I was to others. The boundary held not because I defended it daily, but because it had become part of how I lived. Looking back, I saw the pattern clearly. The moment I stopped proving my worth was the moment it became undeniable. Not to everyone. Not universally. but to the only person it ultimately needed to matter to me. And if there was one lesson I carried forward, it was this: boundaries don't limit love. They reveal whether it was ever there without conditions. A year passed without announcing itself. No milestones worth framing, no single moment that demanded recognition. Just a gradual settling into a life that no longer revolved around tension. When I thought about my family now, it wasn't with the sharpness of hurt or the urgency of repair. It was with proportion. They occupied the space they earned, no more and no less. That, more than reconciliation or distance, felt like healing. At Harbor Link, my role had evolved into something steady and expansive. The systems we built were no longer my projects. They belonged to the organization. That was the point. When a regional director went on extended leave, the operation held. When a new executive joined, the learning curve was steep but navigable. I watched these transitions with a quiet satisfaction, not because I was indispensable, but because I wasn't. For the first time in my career, my success wasn't tied to my exhaustion. Outside of work, my life grew in ways I hadn't anticipated. I started therapy, not to process crisis, but to understand patterns. The kind that makes certain dynamics feel familiar even when they're unhealthy. Naming them was strangely freeing. It explained why I'd stayed silent so long, why competence had felt safer than vulnerability, why being low maintenance had once seemed like a virtue. Healing didn't turn me into someone else. It returned me to myself, before adaptation became armor. My relationship with my parents settled into something quieter. We spoke occasionally, not out of obligation, but when there was something real to share. My father no longer spoke to me as if I were an extension of the business. He asked about my work, not because he needed it, but because he was curious. My mother stopped measuring closeness by access. She listened more than she explained. Neither of them changed overnight, but they changed enough to matter. Enough to be felt. Claire and I rebuilt slowly, on terms that didn't erase history but didn't live inside it either. We met for coffee sometimes. We talked about work, about ambition, about the strange pressure of expectations no one asked for but everyone feels. She admitted once that losing the Harbor Link contract forced her to confront how much had been handed to her without preparation. I didn't take pleasure in that. Growth, I'd learned, wasn't a competition. It was a choice. She was making hers. One evening, during a quiet dinner at home, I realized something that would have felt impossible a year earlier. I wasn't waiting for anything. Not an apology, not recognition, not an invitation to step back into a role that had already cost me too much. The sense of suspension that had defined my adult life was gone. In its place was a groundedness that didn't require explanation. Sometimes, I thought about that graduation dinner, the laughter, the word labor, the way the room had tilted just enough to let me see the truth. I no longer replayed it with bitterness. I understood it as information. Painful, yes, but accurate. It showed me where I stood in a system that relied on my silence, and it gave me the clarity to step out of it. The irony wasn't lost on me. The moment meant to diminish me ended up liberating me, not because I reacted loudly or demanded retribution, but because I responded with alignment. I left. I chose differently. I built a life where my work was named, my boundaries were honored, and my presence wasn't conditional. If there was a lesson I carried forward, it was one I wished more people were taught early: loyalty without reciprocity is not virtue. It's erosion. And love that requires you to disappear is not love you're meant to preserve. I didn't win anything in the way stories usually define winning. There was no dramatic downfall, no triumphant return. What I gained was quieter and far more durable. I kept my integrity. I kept my autonomy. I kept my future intact. And maybe that's the ending that matters most. Not the one where everyone learns their lesson at once, but the one where you do and you choose yourself without apology. So, if you're listening to this and something in it feels uncomfortably familiar, I want you to hear this clearly. You are not difficult for wanting recognition. You are not selfish for setting boundaries. And you are not disloyal for stepping away from systems that only value you when you're quiet. Sometimes, the bravest thing you can do is leave the table where your worth is negotiated and build a life where it isn't.